At first glance, River's Edge Cafe was a picture of tranquility, a haven for the city's elite to sip their lattes and discuss million-dollar deals. But on one seemingly ordinary afternoon, a homeless teenager's desperate warning shattered the calm. "Don't eat that." What began as a quiet lunch for billionaire Edward Caldwell and his elegant wife Veronica quickly unraveled into a web of lies, betrayal, and danger. A single moment of courage from a boy named Liam exposed secrets buried deep within Edward's world. Secrets with the power to destroy lives. From shadowy figures lurking in the night to explosive confrontations at an industrial dockyard, Liam is pulled into a high-stakes game of deception. As Edward's empire becomes the target of a ruthless criminal mastermind, alliances are tested, truths are uncovered, and Liam finds himself facing a deadly question. How far would you go to protect what matters? The River's Edge Cafe hummed with the quiet rhythm of midday conversations. The aroma of freshly baked bread and strong coffee wove between tables as waiters in crisp white uniforms glided between patrons. At a central table, Edward Caldwell, a billionaire with a reputation as sharp as his custom-tailored suit, sat opposite his much younger wife, Veronica. Veronica's glossy black hair shimmered under the sunlight streaming through the cafe's glass ceiling. She tapped idly on her phone, a diamond bracelet glinting on her wrist. Across from her, Edward reviewed his emails, his gold-rimmed glasses slipping down his nose. Near the patio railing stood Liam, a thin teenager with unruly brown hair. His oversized hoodie hung loosely on his wiry frame. To the cafe's wealthy patrons, Liam was invisible, just another scrappy kid from the streets. But his sharp eyes scanned every movement, every subtle detail. He froze when he noticed Veronica's hand move into her designer bag. Her fingers closed around a small vial, and with a swift motion, she tilted its contents into Edward's steaming bowl of bisque. The clear liquid vanished instantly into the creamy soup. Liam's heart pounded. He blinked, questioning his own eyes. Was she? No, it couldn't be. But then, she leaned closer to Edward and whispered with a sweetness that sent shivers down Liam's spine. "You know I hate to see you distracted, darling. Let's enjoy this lunch." Edward gave her a tight smile, his spoon hovering over the bowl as he checked his phone again. Liam clenched the patio railing, torn between fear and an inexplicable urgency. He didn't know Edward Caldwell, but his gut screamed that he couldn't stand by and do nothing. Taking a deep breath, Liam stepped forward. His voice cracked as he shouted, "Don't eat that!" The cafe fell silent. Conversations halted mid-sentence, and heads turned toward the source of the commotion. Edward froze, his spoon mere inches from his lips. Veronica's head whipped around, her expression hardening as she locked eyes with Liam. "What did you just say?" she asked, her voice sharp and cold. "I said don't eat that," Liam repeated, louder this time. He pointed at the bowl. "She put something in your soup. I saw her." Gasps rippled through the cafe. Veronica's face darkened, and she stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You little liar," she hissed, glaring at Liam. "Who let you in here? Are you trying to scam us for money?" Liam's fists clenched, but he held his ground. "I'm not lying," he said, his voice shaking, but determined. "I saw what she did. Smell it if you don't believe me." Edward set his spoon down and leaned back in his chair. His piercing gaze shifted between Liam and Veronica. "Veronica, what is he talking about?" he asked, his tone calm but laced with suspicion. Veronica laughed, a brittle, hollow sound. "Edward, he's just a street kid looking for attention. Don't let him ruin our lunch." But Edward didn't pick up the spoon. Instead, he studied Liam with the practiced eye of a man who had spent decades separating lies from truth. "What's your name, kid?" he asked. "Liam," the boy replied. "And you're sure about what you saw?" "Yes, sir," Liam said firmly. "I swear, She poured something into it when you weren't looking. The tension in the cafe was palpable. Edward's expression grew darker as he turned back to Veronica. "You heard him, Veronica. Care to explain?" Her composure cracked, a flicker of panic flashing in her eyes. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, crossing her arms. "You're seriously going to believe him? He probably doesn't even know who you are." Edward's jaw tightened. His hand trembled as he pushed the soup bowl away. Why would he lie? The murmurs of other patrons grew louder, their curious gazes shifting between the three. Veronica's mask of charm was unraveling by the second. She turned to the growing crowd, her voice rising in desperation. "He's just a filthy liar, a nobody." Liam took a step closer. "Then let someone test it," he challenged. "You've got the money for it." Edward sighed deeply, his sharp gaze never leaving Veronica. "Veronica," he said quietly, "you've been acting strange for weeks. Now this?" Before Veronica could respond, a waiter approached cautiously. "Sir, should I call the police?" The question sent a ripple through the cafe. Veronica's face paled, and for the first time, true fear shone in her eyes. "Don't you dare," she hissed. Edward nodded at the waiter. "Yes, call them." Liam exhaled in relief, but the weight of doubt still pressed on his chest. What if no one believed him? What if Veronica managed to slip away before the truth came to light? As the faint sound of sirens approached in the distance, Liam stood his ground, ready for whatever came next. He had done what he could now. It was up to Edward to uncover the truth hidden behind Veronica's perfect smile. The sirens grew louder, piercing through the hushed whispers and curious stares of the cafe patrons. Veronica shifted uneasily, her polished demeanor unraveling with every passing second. Edward sat still, his eyes fixed on her, his expression unreadable. Liam stood at a distance, his fists clenched tightly, as if bracing for a storm. When the police officers entered, their presence instantly silenced the crowd. The lead officer, a tall man with a commanding presence, approached Edward's table. "We received a call about a possible incident," he said, his tone professional. Edward gestured toward Liam, who stepped forward hesitantly. "This boy claims my wife tampered with my food," Edward explained, his voice calm but firm. "I'd like the soup tested." Veronica immediately cut in, her voice shrill. "This is absurd. He's just a street kid looking for attention. Are we seriously going to entertain this nonsense?" The officer turned to her, his gaze steady. "Ma'am, we'll determine what's nonsense and what isn't." He nodded to a second officer, who carefully picked up the bowl of soup, sealing it in a plastic evidence bag. Veronica's face flushed with anger. "Edward, you can't be serious. You're really letting this vagrant dictate what happens in our lives?" Edward didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Liam. "Tell them exactly what you saw," he said. Liam swallowed hard, feeling the weight of every pair of eyes in the room on him. "I saw her take a small bottle from her bag," he said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "It had clear liquid in it. She poured it into the soup and stirred it. I swear I'm telling the truth." The lead officer turned back to Veronica. "Ma'am, do you have anything to say about this?" Veronica hesitated, her gaze darting between Edward and the officers. I don't know what he's talking about. He's lying," she stammered. Edward leaned forward, his tone icy. "Lying, Veronica? Why would he lie about something like this? What could he possibly gain?" Veronica opened her mouth to respond, but hesitated, her words faltering. Before she could say more, the officer addressed Edward. "We'll send the sample to the lab for testing, but it may take some time. In the meantime, we'd like to ask a few more questions." As the officers began their questioning, Veronica's mask of composure continued to slip. Her responses grew more defensive, her voice rising in desperation. "This is ridiculous," she repeated over and over, as though saying it enough times would make it true. Edward, however, remained calm, his sharp eyes studying her every move. Liam, standing nearby, felt his anxiety build with each passing moment. The doubt he had pushed away earlier began to creep back in. What if the soup was clean? What if Veronica managed to twist the truth and turn everyone against him? Then, an unexpected interruption shifted the room's atmosphere. "Excuse me," a deep voice called out. A man stepped forward from the back of the cafe. He wore a tailored suit, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed, and an air of authority surrounded him. "Who are you?" the officer asked. "My name is Thomas Clay," the man replied, pulling out a leather wallet and flashing a badge. "Private investigator." Veronica's face turned ghostly pale. Edward's eyes narrowed. "What are you doing here, Thomas?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. Thomas glanced at Edward, then at Veronica. "I've been working on something you might want to hear about." The cafe fell silent again, as all attention turned to Thomas. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket and flipped it open. "Mr. Caldwell, you hired me a month ago to look into some financial discrepancies in your company." Edward nodded slowly. "I remember. What does that have to do with this?" Thomas hesitated for a moment, then said, "I found more than just discrepancies. I found connections between your wife and certain individuals who've been siphoning money from your accounts." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Edward's expression darkened. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Thomas continued, "that this might not just be about your lunch. It's possible someone has been planning to remove you altogether." Veronica slammed her hands on the table, her voice trembling with fury. "This is outrageous. You can't just accuse me of something like that without proof." Thomas remained unfazed. "Oh, I have proof," he said, pulling out a series of photos. He placed them on the table, each showing Veronica meeting with an unknown man in various locations. Edward's hands shook as he picked up the photos. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Who is this man?" Thomas answered gravely. "A chemist with a history of manufacturing untraceable poisons." The room seemed to hold its breath. Veronica's carefully constructed facade finally shattered. Her eyes darted around wildly, searching for an escape. "You don't understand," she cried. "I didn't have a choice. They forced me to do it." Edward stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. His voice was cold and commanding. "Forced you? By whom? Why?" Veronica didn't answer, her silence speaking louder than words. The lead officer nodded to his partner. "Take her into custody for further questioning," he said. As Veronica was escorted out, the weight of what had just happened settled over the cafe. Edward turned to Liam, who stood frozen in place. "You were right," Edward said quietly. "You saw what I didn't." Liam didn't know how to respond. He had done what he thought was right, but he never expected it to lead to this. Edward placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Stay," he said. "I think we have a lot to talk about." Liam sat awkwardly across from Edward in the now empty cafe, the tension still lingering like a stubborn shadow. The police had taken Veronica away for questioning, leaving a trail of whispers among the staff and remaining patrons. Edward leaned back in his chair, his gold-rimmed glasses catching the afternoon light, his expression a mix of weariness and resolve. "You did something brave today, Liam," Edward said, breaking the silence. "But I need to know why. Why didn't you just walk away?" Liam hesitated, his hands gripping the edge of the table. I don't like seeing people get hurt," he said quietly. "I've seen enough of it already." Edward studied the boy for a long moment. "There's more to it than that, isn't there?" Liam shrugged, but the weight of unspoken truths clung to him. "Let's just say I know what it's like to lose everything because of someone else's choices." Before Edward could press further, the cafe door opened, and Thomas Clay, the private investigator, stepped back inside. He approached their table with a purposeful stride, his notebook in hand. "Mr. Caldwell," Thomas began, nodding briefly to Liam, "there's more you need to know. What we've uncovered goes deeper than just your wife's betrayal." Edward's brow furrowed. "Deeper how?" Thomas pulled out a file and laid it on the table. In the last month, I've traced multiple transactions from your personal accounts to an offshore entity. The timing aligns suspiciously with Veronica's recent behavior. But here's where it gets interesting. He flipped open the file, revealing photos of a man with a thin, angular face. This is Victor Hale. He's a known operator in underground networks specializing in corporate espionage, sabotage, and, as we suspect here, assassinations. Edward's jaw tightened. And you're saying Veronica was working with him? Thomas nodded. She met with him several times over the past 3 months. My guess is that she was promised a hefty sum in exchange for her cooperation. Liam, who had been silently observing, couldn't contain his curiosity. Why would she do it? He blurted out. She already had money, didn't she? Thomas glanced at the boy, a faint smile crossing his face. Good question, but money isn't always the motivation. Sometimes it's power, or revenge, or control, Edward interrupted, his voice bitter. Veronica hated feeling like she was in my shadow. She wanted control over everything. I just didn't realize how far she'd go to get it. Thomas cleared his throat, bringing their focus back. There's one more thing, he said, pulling out another photo. It showed Veronica sitting across from Victor Hale, but in the background was another familiar face. Edward stiffened. That's Marcus Langston. Who's Marcus Langston? Liam asked. Edward's tone turned cold. He's my former business partner. We built this company together, but I forced him out 10 years ago when I discovered he was embezzling funds. I thought he'd disappeared. Thomas leaned forward, his voice lowering. It seems he's been holding a grudge, and now he's working with Veronica and Hale. Edward's fingers drummed against the table, the weight of the betrayal settling in. If Marcus is involved, this isn't just about money. He wants to destroy everything I've built. Liam spoke up again, his voice hesitant. But if they wanted to destroy you, why not just go after your company? Why this whole thing with the soup? Thomas exchanged a glance with Edward. That's the million-dollar question, Thomas said. Hale doesn't leave loose ends. Whatever their plan is, it's personal. Edward nodded grimly. It always is with Marcus. As the conversation deepened, Liam's sharp eyes caught movement outside the cafe. A dark sedan idled across the street, its tinted windows obscuring whoever sat inside. His gut tightened. Someone's watching, Liam said, nodding toward the car. Thomas turned, his expression hardening. Stay here, he said, slipping a hand into his jacket pocket. I'll handle this. Before anyone could protest, Thomas strode out of the cafe and approached the car. Edward and Liam watched through the window as Thomas gestured for the driver to lower the window. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, without warning, the car peeled away, tires screeching against the pavement. Thomas returned moments later, his jaw set. We're being followed, he confirmed. Hale's people, most likely. They know we're on to them. Edward stood, his commanding presence filling the room. We're not going to sit around and wait for them to make the next move. Thomas, I want you to find Hale. Find Marcus. I want this ended. Thomas nodded, but his gaze flicked to Liam. What about the kid? If Hale's people know he was involved, he's at risk too. Edward turned to Liam, his expression softening. Do you have somewhere safe to go? Liam hesitated. Not really. Then you're staying with me, Edward said firmly, at least until this is over. Liam blinked, the offer catching him off guard. You don't have to do that, he said quickly. I'll be fine. Edward's tone left no room for argument. You saved my life today. Now it's my turn to make sure you're safe. As the trio prepared to leave the cafe, the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on all of them. What had started as a simple act of courage had uncovered a dangerous web of betrayal and vengeance. And as they stepped into the crisp evening air, it was clear that this was only the beginning. Liam sat in the back seat of Edward's sleek black car, his gaze fixed on the city lights flashing by. The tension from the cafe still clung to him like a heavy coat. Next to him, Edward sat silently, his hands gripping his phone as he made call after call. Up front, Thomas drove with a sharp focus, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. "Anything yet?" Edward asked, his voice breaking the silence. Thomas shook his head. "Hale's good at covering his tracks. He's probably already moved by now. But Marcus is a different story. I have a feeling he'll surface soon enough." Liam shifted uneasily. "Why does this Marcus guy hate you so much?" Edward sighed, leaning back in his seat. "Marcus and I started the company together. We were friends, more like brothers. But as the company grew, so did his greed. I found out he was embezzling funds, millions of dollars, to finance his gambling debts. I gave him a choice: leave quietly, or I'd press charges. He left, but not without making it clear he'd make me pay someday." "Sounds like he took that promise seriously," Liam muttered. Edward glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It seems so." The car turned onto a long, winding driveway that led to Edward's estate. The gates opened with a quiet hum, revealing a sprawling mansion surrounded by meticulously maintained gardens. Liam stared out the window, his eyes widening at the sheer size of the place. "This is where you live?" he asked, his voice tinged with awe. Edward nodded. "It's home. For now." As they entered the house, the tension seemed to ease, if only slightly. Edward led Liam to a cozy guest room down the hall. The room was simple compared to the rest of the mansion, but still luxurious by any standard Liam had ever known. "This will be your room," Edward said. "There's a bathroom through that door, and the kitchen is downstairs if you get hungry. Make yourself at home." Liam hesitated at the threshold. "Thanks," he said quietly. Edward nodded and left, closing the door behind him. Liam sat on the edge of the bed, the events of the day replaying in his mind. He had saved a man's life, exposed a conspiracy, and now he was in the middle of a war between people far more powerful than he could have imagined. He barely had time to process it before a soft knock sounded on his door. Thomas stepped inside, his expression serious. "Mind if I sit?" Thomas asked. Liam shrugged. "Go ahead." Thomas pulled up a chair, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "You've done a lot today, kid. More than most people your age or any age would have done." "I just did what I thought was right," Liam said. "And that's exactly why you're here," Thomas replied. "But I need you to be honest with me. Have you ever crossed paths with anyone like Victor Hale or Marcus Langston before?" Liam frowned. "No. Why would I?" Thomas studied him for a moment, as if trying to read the truth in his eyes. "Hale doesn't usually leave loose ends. If he knows you're involved, he might try to get to you to send a message. I need to know if there's anything in your past that could connect you to him." Liam hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "There's nothing," he said finally. "Just bad luck, I guess." Thomas didn't push further, but his expression remained thoughtful. "Stay alert," he said, standing, "and if you see or hear anything suspicious, let me know immediately." Liam nodded, and Thomas left the room. Downstairs, Edward sat in his study, a glass of bourbon in hand. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Thomas joined him, closing the door behind him. "He's hiding something," Thomas said without preamble. Edward raised an eyebrow. "The boy? What makes you think that?" Thomas crossed his arms. "Call it instinct. He's street smart, sure, but he's also cautious. Too cautious for someone who's supposed to be just a homeless kid. He's seen more than he's letting on." Edward swirled his glass thoughtfully. "Even if he is hiding something, it doesn't change what he did today. He saved my life, Thomas." "I'm not saying he's a threat," Thomas clarified. "But if we're going up against Hale and Marcus, we need to know who we can trust. And right now, I'm not sure about him." Edward sighed, setting his glass down. Keep an eye on him, but don't push too hard. He's just a kid." Thomas nodded, though his expression remained skeptical. Later that night, as the mansion lay quiet, Liam stirred in his sleep. A faint noise reached his ears, pulling him from his dreams. He sat up, his heart pounding. The sound came again, a faint tapping at the window. Liam crept to the window and peered out into the darkness. At first he saw nothing. Then movement caught his eye. A figure stood near the edge of the garden, barely visible in the moonlight. Liam's breath hitched. The figure raised a hand, pointing directly at him, before slipping back into the shadows. A cold chill ran down Liam's spine. He grabbed the door handle, intending to wake Edward or Thomas, but paused. Whoever it was, they had come for him. And deep down, Liam realized this wasn't just Edward's fight anymore. Liam stood frozen at the window, his breath shallow as he replayed what he had seen. The figure had been too far away to make out any details, but the gesture, a deliberate point aimed directly at him, felt like a warning. Or worse, a promise. For a moment, he considered waking Edward or Thomas. But then a voice in his head whispered, "What if they think you're imagining things?" He had only been in this house for a few hours. He didn't want to seem paranoid or ungrateful. Still, his instincts told him he couldn't ignore it. Grabbing his hoodie from the chair by the bed, Liam quietly slipped out of his room and into the darkened hallway. He moved cautiously, his steps muffled by the thick carpet as he made his way to the study where Edward and Thomas had been earlier. The door was ajar, and Liam peered inside. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint orange glow. Edward was slumped in his chair, asleep, an empty glass on the table beside him. Thomas was nowhere to be seen. Liam hesitated. Waking Edward now didn't feel right. He seemed exhausted, and Liam couldn't bring himself to disturb the man who had shown him kindness. Instead, he decided to investigate on his own. The mansion's back door creaked softly as Liam stepped outside. The cool night air wrapped around him, and the garden stretched out in all directions, its neatly trimmed hedges casting long shadows under the moonlight. He stood still for a moment, listening. The wind rustled through the trees, but otherwise the night was silent. Liam's eyes scanned the garden, searching for any sign of the figure he had seen earlier. "Where are you?" he muttered under his breath. A faint sound, a twig snapping, made him whip around. His heart pounded as he caught sight of movement near the edge of the garden. The figure was back, standing partially obscured by the shadows of the trees. "Hey!" Liam called out, his voice low but firm. "I see you." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned and disappeared into the trees. Without thinking, Liam took off after it, his feet pounding against the grass. The garden gave way to a small wooded area, the air cooler and the darkness thicker under the canopy of trees. Liam's breaths came quick and shallow as he followed the faint rustling ahead. He couldn't see the figure anymore, but the sound of their movement guided him. Finally, the rustling stopped. Liam slowed, his heart racing as he approached a clearing. He froze when he saw the figure standing there, illuminated by a shaft of moonlight. It was a man, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by a hood. In one hand, he held a folded piece of paper. He extended it toward Liam without a word. Liam's instincts screamed at him to run, but his curiosity held him in place. Slowly, he stepped forward and snatched the paper from the man's hand. "What do you want?" Liam demanded, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound brave. The man tilted his head, almost as if amused, then turned and vanished into the trees before Liam could say another word. Liam unfolded the paper, his hands shaking. Written in neat, precise handwriting was a single sentence: "Stay out of it, or you'll regret it." Liam returned to the mansion, his mind racing. He slipped back inside through the same door and headed straight for the study. Edward was still asleep, but Thomas had returned, leaning against the desk as he reviewed a file. Thomas looked up as Liam entered. "What are you doing up?" he asked, his voice sharp with suspicion. "I saw someone," Liam blurted out, holding up the note. "They were outside, and they gave me this." Thomas straightened, his eyes narrowing as he took the note from Liam. He read it quickly, his jaw tightening. "Where did you see them?" "By the edge of the garden," Liam said. "I followed them into the trees. They didn't say anything, just gave me that and left." Thomas cursed under his breath. "Hale's people," he muttered. "They know you're here." Edward stirred, groaning softly as he woke. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice thick with sleep. Thomas handed him the note. "Liam had a visitor," he said grimly. Edward read the note, his expression darkening. He stood, his commanding presence returning, as if the exhaustion had vanished. "We need to lock this place down," he said, "and we need to find Hale before he makes his next move." Thomas nodded. "Agreed. I'll make some calls. Get more security out here." Edward turned to Liam, his expression softening. "You did the right thing telling us," he said. "But from now on, no more going outside alone. If they're targeting you, we need to be careful." Liam nodded, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "What are we going to do?" he asked. Edward's gaze was steady, his determination palpable. "We're going to turn the tables. If Hale and Marcus want to fight, they'll get one." As the mansion came alive with preparations, Liam found himself standing at a window, staring out at the dark garden. The note was still in his pocket, a reminder of the danger lurking just beyond the safety of the walls. He had thought this was Edward's fight, but now he realized it was his fight too, and no matter how scared he wasn't going to back down. The mansion was unusually tense the following morning. A quiet urgency rippled through the house as Edward, Thomas, and a newly arrived security team worked to fortify its defenses. Cameras were checked, gates reinforced, and guards stationed at strategic points around the property. Liam sat at the kitchen counter, watching the flurry of activity from a distance. His stomach churned with unease. Despite the added security, the memory of the hooded figure from the night before lingered in his mind, as did the note's chilling warning. Edward entered the kitchen, looking sharper than he had the night before. His suit was perfectly tailored, his demeanor controlled, but Liam could sense the tension beneath his composed exterior. "Liam," Edward began, pouring himself a cup of coffee, "I've arranged for you to stay at a safe house until this is over. It's better if you're out of the line of fire." Liam's heart sank. "You're sending me away?" Edward nodded. "It's for your own safety. Hale and Marcus are dangerous, and they know you're involved. If something happens here, I don't want you caught in the crossfire." "But I can help," Liam protested. "I've already helped. I'm the one who saw what Veronica did. I can keep my eyes open, catch things others might miss." Edward's expression softened, but his tone remained firm. "You've done more than enough, Liam. You don't owe me anything else." Before Liam could argue further, Thomas appeared in the doorway, his phone pressed to his ear. He gestured for Edward to follow him into the hall. "I'll be back," Edward said, placing a reassuring hand on Liam's shoulder. Liam stayed in the kitchen, staring down at his untouched plate of toast. The thought of leaving felt wrong, like he was running away when things were just getting started. A faint beep interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see one of the kitchen monitors flickers. The screen, which displayed a live feed from the security cameras, briefly showed static, before settling on an empty stretch of the driveway. Liam frowned. Something about the scene felt off. He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he noticed faint movement in the trees lining the driveway. "Hey!" Liam called out, bolting from his seat. He ran to find Thomas, who was still on the phone in Edward's study. "What is it?" Thomas asked, lowering the phone. "The cameras," Liam said, breathless. "There's something in the trees near the driveway. It looked like movement." Thomas was on his feet in an instant. "Stay here," he ordered, but Liam followed him anyway, trailing behind as they headed to the security room. Inside, a technician was monitoring the camera feeds. Thomas gestured to the screen Liam had seen earlier. "Rewind that footage," he ordered. The technician complied, scrubbing back a few seconds until the faint movement was visible again. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a shadow shifting among the trees. "Zoom in," Thomas said. The grainy image revealed the outline of a man crouched low in the foliage, dressed in black and holding what appeared to be a handheld device. "Damn it," Thomas muttered. "Hale's already making his move." "What's he doing?" Liam asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Scanning for blind spots," Thomas replied. "They're looking for a way in." Thomas grabbed his radio. "Team Alpha, we've got movement on the northeast perimeter. Close it down and sweep the area." The guards moved swiftly, combing through the wooded section of the property. Edward joined Thomas and Liam in the security room, his expression grim. "They're probing us," Edward said. "Hale wants to see how far he can push before we react." "And now we know he's close," Thomas replied. Minutes later, the radio crackled. "Perimeter secure? No sign of the intruder," one of the guards reported. Edward exhaled sharply. "He's testing us, but he won't stop there." Later that evening, as the mansion settled into an uneasy calm, Thomas pulled Edward aside. "We can't just sit back and defend," he said. "Hale's too smart for that. He'll keep pushing until he finds a weakness." Edward nodded. "I know. We need to hit him first." Thomas pulled out his phone, scrolling through a series of encrypted messages. "I've been tracking one of his associates, a man named Jared Cobb. He's a low-level operator, but he handles logistics for Hale. If we can get to him, we might find out where Hale is hiding." "Do it," Edward said. "Whatever it takes." The plan was set in motion quickly. Thomas left the mansion that night, heading for a location where Cobb was rumored to be operating. Edward, meanwhile, stayed behind, doubling the mansion's defenses. Liam watched the preparations with a mix of fear and determination. Despite Edward's insistence that he leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was meant to be here. Hours later, Thomas called. His voice crackled through Edward's phone, tense but triumphant. "I've got Cobb," he said. "He's not talking yet, but he's scared. Give me a few hours, and I'll have answers." Edward's jaw tightened. "Be careful, Thomas. If Hale finds out—" "He won't," Thomas interrupted. "Not until it's too late." As Edward hung up, Liam approached cautiously. "What happens now?" he asked. Edward's gaze was sharp, his resolve unwavering. "Now we get ready. When Hale comes, we'll be waiting." Liam nodded, a surge of determination rising within him. He had come this far. He wasn't about to back down now. The mansion was eerily quiet as midnight approached. Liam sat in the corner of the study, watching Edward pore over documents and security plans. The older man's focus was unyielding, his determination almost intimidating. Liam broke the silence. "Do you really think Thomas can get that guy to talk?" Edward didn't look up from the map spread across the desk. "Thomas is the best at what he does. If Cobb knows anything, Thomas will get it out of him." Liam leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. The unease gnawed at him, and he couldn't tell if it was intuition or paranoia. Suddenly, Edward's phone buzzed on the desk. He snatched it up, glancing at the caller ID before answering. "Thomas?" "It's me," Thomas said, his voice edged with urgency. Cobb talked. "You're not going to like what I found." Edward's jaw tightened. "What is it?" "Hale knows you're digging," Thomas replied. "He's accelerating his plan, and he's got help." "What kind of help?" Edward demanded. "Marcus Langston," Thomas said grimly. "The two of them have been working together for months, planning this. Cobb says Marcus is feeding Hale inside information, everything from your security protocols to your business dealings." Edward cursed under his breath. "So, Marcus hasn't just been holding a grudge? He's been preparing for this." "There's more," Thomas continued. "Hale isn't just after you. He's targeting Liam, too." Liam, who had been listening intently, froze. Me? Thomas's voice softened. Cobb didn't know why, but Hale's people have been tracking you. My guess is they see you as a loose end, someone who knows too much. Edward's expression darkened. Then we need to act fast. Did Cobb give you anything on Hale's location? A safe house, Thomas said. Cobb claims Hale's been using it as a staging ground. I'm sending you the address now. Good work, Edward said. Get back here as soon as you can. We'll plan the next move. Minutes later, Thomas's message came through, displaying an address on the outskirts of the city. Edward studied it carefully before turning to Liam. You're staying here, Edward said firmly. This isn't your fight. It is if they're after me, Liam countered. I can help. Edward sighed, his frustration evident. Liam, this isn't a game. Hale is dangerous. If you come with me, you'll be putting yourself in even more danger. I've already been in danger, Liam said, his voice steady. And if Hale's targeting me, I have a right to know why. Edward hesitated, the weight of the decision clear on his face. Finally, he relented. Fine, but you stay close to me. No wandering off. The drive to the safe house was tense. Edward, Liam, and a small team of security personnel moved under the cover of darkness, their vehicles blending into the empty streets. When they arrived, the safe house appeared unremarkable, a rundown building at the edge of an industrial park. But as they approached, it was clear something was off. The front door hung ajar, and the faint glow of a single light flickered inside. Edward raised a hand, signaling for silence. He motioned for his team to spread out and secure the perimeter, while he and Liam crept toward the door. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and stale cigarettes. The furniture was sparse, and papers were scattered across a rickety table. Edward moved cautiously, his sharp eyes scanning every corner. Liam trailed behind, his nerves on edge. He tried to focus, but his mind kept racing with questions. Why would Hale target him? What could he possibly have done to make himself a threat? Edward reached the table and sifted through the papers. It's a staging area, all right, he muttered. Maps, surveillance photos, schedules. Liam stepped closer and froze when he saw one of the photos. It was of him, standing outside the cafe. They've been watching me, Liam said, his voice barely above a whisper. Edward's expression darkened as he picked up the photo. This isn't just a random attack. Hale's been planning this for a while. Before Liam could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the back of the house. Edward motioned for silence, drawing a pistol from his holster. Stay behind me, he whispered. Liam obeyed, his heart hammering in his chest as they moved toward the source of the noise. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped abruptly. Edward rounded the corner, his weapon raised, only to find an empty hallway. Check the rooms, he ordered his team through his radio. The security team swept through the building, but it quickly became apparent that whoever had been there was gone. They left in a hurry, Edward said, scanning the hallway. But why? As they returned to the main room, Liam noticed something on the table they had missed earlier, a small, blinking device. Edward, Liam said urgently, pointing at it. Edward's eyes widened. It's a trap! Everyone out! Now! The team bolted for the door, Liam barely keeping up as they sprinted outside. They were halfway to the cars when the explosion ripped through the air, the safe house erupting in a ball of fire. The shockwave knocked Liam off his feet, the sound deafening. He scrambled to his knees, his ears ringing as Edward pulled him up. Are you okay? Edward shouted over the chaos. Liam nodded, though his legs felt like jelly. What just happened? Edward's face was grim. Hale. He wanted us to find this place. He's sending a message. As the flames consumed the safe house, one thing was clear. Hale was always one step ahead. The fire still roared behind them as Edward's team regrouped near the vehicles. The acrid smell of smoke filled the air, stinging Liam's nose and eyes. He leaned against one of the cars, struggling to steady his breathing. Edward barked orders into his radio, his voice tight with anger. "Everyone accounted for? Any injuries?" One of the guards stepped forward, wiping soot from his face. "No injuries, sir. But the place is gone. Whatever intel we could have recovered is ashes now." Edward clenched his fists, his frustration evident. "Hale's playing games. He wanted us here, wanted us to think we were closing in." Thomas's voice crackled through Edward's phone, cutting into the tense silence. "I heard the explosion. Are you all right?" Edward nodded, though he knew Thomas couldn't see him. "We're fine. The safe house was rigged. Hale's taunting us." There was a brief pause before Thomas spoke again, his tone grim. "Then he's already moving to the next phase. Cobb warned me Hale's operations never stall. If this failed, it means the real attack is already in motion." Edward glanced at Liam, who was still pale from the ordeal. "Do you have any idea what he's planning next?" "Not yet," Thomas admitted. "But there's one thing we know for sure: Hale thrives on precision. He doesn't leave room for error. We need to think like him, anticipate his next move." Edward exhaled sharply. "Get back here. We're running out of time." Back at the mansion, the atmosphere was charged with urgency. Edward's security team fortified their defenses, and Thomas arrived an hour later, carrying a worn leather briefcase. Inside the study, Thomas spread a collection of documents, maps, and photos across Edward's desk. Liam stood nearby, listening intently as the two men pieced together the fragmented clues. "Hale's been watching both of you," Thomas said, pointing to a surveillance photo of Liam outside the cafe. "But he's not just watching. He's planning to strike where it'll hurt the most." Edward's gaze hardened. "My company?" Thomas shook his head. "It's bigger than that. This isn't just about money or reputation anymore. Hale and Marcus are going after everything: your legacy, your life, and anyone tied to you. Liam included." Liam stiffened. "But why me? I'm just some kid off the street." Thomas locked eyes with him. "Not to Hale. To him, you're the wild card, the one thing he didn't plan for. You exposed Veronica, threw off his timeline, and now he sees you as a threat." Edward leaned forward, his tone low but intense. "Then we need to stop him before he gets another chance. Do we have any leads?" Thomas tapped a map of the city. "1. Cobb mentioned a secondary location Hale uses for operations. A warehouse in the dockyards. It's heavily secured, but it might be where they're coordinating the next move." Edward stood, his determination evident. "Then we're not waiting for him to come to us. We're taking the fight to him." Night fell again, as Edward, Thomas, and their team prepared for the operation. Liam watched from the sidelines, a mix of fear and determination bubbling within him. "You're staying here this time," Edward told him firmly. Liam shook his head. "No way. If this is about me too, I'm not hiding. I can help." Edward hesitated, but Thomas stepped in. "He's right. Hale's already targeted him. If Liam's with us, at least we can keep him safe." Edward sighed, his jaw tightening. "Fine, but you do exactly as you're told. No heroics." The docks were a labyrinth of shipping containers and dimly lit pathways. The warehouse loomed ahead, its exterior deceptively quiet. Edward's team spread out, taking positions around the perimeter. Thomas motioned for Liam to stay close as they approached the building's side entrance. The lock was electronic, but Thomas quickly bypassed it with a small device, and the door creaked open. Inside, the air was cool and stale. The sound of faint voices echoed from somewhere deeper within. Edward signaled for silence, and the group moved cautiously through the maze of crates and machinery. Liam's heart raced as they entered a large central room. A table sat in the center, covered with maps and documents. But the room was empty. "This feels wrong," Edward muttered, scanning the area. Thomas moved to the table, his eyes narrowing as he examined the papers. "These are fake," he said, holding up a map. "They wanted us to find this." A sudden clang echoed behind them, and the door slammed shut. The sound of heavy locks clicking into place sent a chill down Liam's spine. Edward spun around, his gun drawn. "It's a trap!" From the shadows, a voice rang out, smooth and mocking. "Took you long enough to figure that out." Hale stepped into the dim light, his tall frame exuding confidence. His angular face was sharp and calculated, and a cold smile played on his lips. Behind him, a dozen armed men emerged, their weapons trained on Edward's team. Edward's expression was steely. "Hale!" Hale chuckled. "You've always been predictable, Edward. Charging in, thinking you're in control. But this is my game." Thomas shifted, his hand inching toward his weapon. "What do you want, Hale?" "Everything," Hale replied smoothly. "Your company, your reputation, your life. And as for the boy—" His eyes flicked to Liam, sending a shiver down his spine. "He's my insurance." Edward stepped forward, his voice cold. "You're not touching him." Hale's smile widened. "That's where you're wrong." The room erupted into chaos as Hale's men surged forward, weapons raised. Edward's team fired back, the sharp crack of gunfire echoing through the warehouse. Liam ducked behind a crate, his heart pounding. He could hear Edward shouting orders, but the cacophony of the fight drowned out his words. Through the chaos, Hale slipped away, disappearing into the shadows. Liam's instincts kicked in. Ignoring Edward's earlier warning, he crept after Hale, his footsteps silent as he moved through the labyrinth of crates. He found Hale near the rear exit, preparing to flee. Summoning his courage, Liam stepped into the open. "Stop!" Hale turned, his expression darkening. "You should have stayed hidden, kid." Liam swallowed hard, his voice trembling, but resolute. "I'm not afraid of you," Hale smirked, taking a step closer. "You should be—" The warehouse fell into a frenzy of noise and chaos, but for Liam, everything narrowed to the chilling presence of Hale. The man's smirk deepened as he took another deliberate step forward, his sharp eyes locked on Liam like a predator stalking its prey. "You've got guts, kid," Hale said, his voice low and taunting. "But bravery without brains? That's a death sentence." Liam's hands clenched into fists at his sides. His heart pounded, but he refused to show fear. "I stopped you once," he said, his voice shaky but defiant. "I can do it again." Hale chuckled darkly. "Stopped me? No, Liam. You've only delayed the inevitable." Hale shifted slightly, his movements calculated. Liam's gaze darted to the man's hand, where he noticed a glint of metal, a gun tucked into the waistband of Hale's coat. Liam's breath caught. He had no weapon, no backup, and no idea how to stop the man before him. But then, an idea sparked. If he couldn't overpower Hale, maybe he could outthink him. "I know what you're doing," Liam said suddenly, his voice louder, more confident. "You think if you get rid of me, you'll have control. But you're wrong." Hale's expression flickered with curiosity. "Go on then. Enlighten me." "You think Marcus is on your side?" Liam said, taking a small step back to maintain distance. "He's using you, just like he used Veronica. You're nothing but a pawn to him." Hale's smirk faltered, his brows knitting together. "Nice try, kid. Marcus and I have an understanding." "Do you?" Liam pressed, his tone sharper now. "Because the last I checked, Marcus doesn't share power. Once you've done his dirty work, he'll toss you aside just like he did with everyone else." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Hale hesitated. Liam seized the opportunity, stepping closer to a nearby stack of crates, hoping to keep the man distracted. Before Hale could respond, the crackle of a radio interrupted. From the device clipped to Hale's belt, a voice came through. "The targets are regrouping. We're losing control of the perimeter." Hale's jaw tightened as he yanked the radio free. "Hold your positions," he barked, his composure slipping. Liam's mind raced. Edward and Thomas were fighting back, and Hale's men were faltering. If he could keep Hale distracted long enough, they might have a chance to turn the tide. "You're losing," Liam said, his tone steady. You should have left while you had the chance. Hale rounded on him, his patience snapping. Enough! He drew the gun from his waistband, leveling it at Liam. Liam froze, his heart hammering in his chest. You think you're clever? Hale sneered, his finger hovering over the trigger. This ends now. A sudden crash echoed through the warehouse as a figure tackled Hale from the side, sending the gun skittering across the floor. Liam stumbled back, his eyes widening as Thomas wrestled with Hale, the two men locked in a fierce struggle. Run! Thomas shouted over his shoulder. Liam hesitated for a split second before darting toward the fight. His eyes locked on the gun lying a few feet away, and he made a split-second decision. He dove for it, his fingers closing around the cool metal. Hale, realizing what Liam was doing, shoved Thomas off him and lunged toward the boy. But Liam was faster. He scrambled to his feet, pointing the gun at Hale with trembling hands. Stay back! Liam shouted, his voice cracking. Hale stopped in his tracks, his cold gaze fixed on the gun. Slowly, he raised his hands, a mocking smile curling his lips. Look at you, the little hero. Thomas stood, his breathing labored, as he positioned himself between Liam and Hale. Good job, kid. Now hand me the gun. Liam's hands shook as he lowered the weapon and passed it to Thomas, who immediately leveled it at Hale. This is over, Thomas said, his tone steel. Is it? Hale replied, his smirk returning. You've won the battle, maybe, but the war? You're already too late. What are you talking about? Thomas demanded, stepping closer. Hale's smile widened, his voice dripping with malice. You think I'd put all my eggs in one basket? The dockyard was never the real plan. This was just a distraction. Thomas's grip on the gun tightened. What's the real plan? Hale laughed, the sound echoing through the warehouse. You'll find out soon enough, and when you do, it'll be too late to stop it. Before Thomas could respond, a flashbang grenade rolled into the room, its bright light and deafening bang overwhelming them all. Liam hit the ground, covering his ears as chaos erupted around him. When the ringing in his ears subsided, he looked up to find Hale gone. Thomas cursed under his breath, scanning the room. He had backup. They extracted him. Liam sat up, his head pounding. What do we do now? Thomas offered him a hand, helping him to his feet. We regroup, and we prepare for whatever comes next. As they emerged from the warehouse, the weight of Hale's parting words hung heavily in the air. The fight wasn't over, it had only just begun. The drive back to the mansion was tense, the weight of Hale's ominous words pressing down on everyone. The realization that the warehouse had been a decoy burned in Edward's mind, and Thomas's jaw remained clenched as he ran through every possible angle of Hale's next move. Liam sat silently in the back seat, the events of the night replaying in his mind. He had faced Hale, stared into the eyes of a man who thought nothing of destroying lives, and somehow come out alive. But the danger wasn't over. Hale had something bigger planned, and they had no idea what or where it was. Edward broke the silence. Thomas, we need answers now. Pull every resource we have, bank records, surveillance footage, anything. We're not waiting for Hale to strike again. I'm already on it, Thomas replied, pulling out his phone. Cobb's intel wasn't worthless. There were mentions of a high-profile target, something Hale referred to as the crown jewel. If we can figure out what that is, we can stop him. Liam leaned forward. What does that mean? The crown jewels? Edward's gaze met Liam's in the rearview mirror. It means Hale isn't just targeting me. He's targeting something or someone that could cripple everything I've built. Back at the mansion, the team worked tirelessly through the night. Thomas combed through data while Edward coordinated with his security contacts. Liam paced the study, feeling both restless and useless. Finally, Thomas slammed a folder onto the desk. I've got it, he said, his voice tight with urgency. Edward leaned over the papers. What is it? Hale's crown jewel, Thomas said, pointing to a map. He's targeting your company's tech summit tomorrow. It's the biggest public event tied to your name, and it's a prime opportunity for chaos. Executives, investors, press, it's all there. Edward's face darkened. He wants to destroy my reputation. Public humiliation. If he disrupts the summit, it'll shatter confidence in everything we've built. Liam frowned. But how? What's he planning to do? Thomas pulled out a photo of a sleek metallic device. It's a prototype your company developed, a state-of-the-art encryption device. If Hale gets his hands on it, he could access classified data from corporations and governments worldwide. He wouldn't just ruin you, he'd have leverage over anyone he wanted. Edward slammed his fist onto the desk. We can't let that happen. The next morning, Edward, Thomas, and Liam arrived at the summit. Security was already heightened, but Edward's team added extra measures, scanning every attendee and double-checking every piece of equipment. Liam stuck close to Edward, feeling the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. The massive conference hall buzzed with activity, the air thick with tension as they prepared for the worst. Edward pulled Thomas aside. Do we have eyes on Hale? Thomas shook his head. Not yet. He's too smart to show his face here, but his people are definitely in play. Liam, overhearing their conversation, spoke up. If Hale isn't here, that means he's watching. He wants to see this go down. Edward nodded, his expression grim. Then we flush him out. Thomas, find his men. Liam, stay with me. Hours passed, and the summit unfolded without incident. But the tension never eased. Liam scanned the crowd, searching for anything or anyone out of place. Then he saw him, a man in a maintenance uniform, lingering near the stage where the prototype was displayed. His movements were subtle, but his eyes darted around the room with purpose. Edward, Liam whispered, tugging at his sleeve. I think that guy's one of Hale's. Edward followed Liam's gaze, his expression sharpening. Good eye. Stay here. Edward signaled to Thomas, and the two men moved toward the stage, blending into the crowd as they approached the suspect. The man noticed them too late. Edward grabbed his arm, pinning him against the wall. Who sent you? He demanded. The man smirked, his defiance unnerving. You already know. Thomas patted him down, pulling a small device from his pocket. What's this? A trigger, the man said, his grin widening. Too bad you're not fast enough to stop what's coming. Thomas's eyes widened. Edward, the prototype, it's rigged. Edward turned to Liam, who stood frozen by the commotion. Liam, get to the stage and warn them now. Liam didn't hesitate. He sprinted through the crowd, dodging startled attendees as he raced toward the stage. He leapt onto the platform, startling the presenter mid-speech. You have to stop, Liam shouted, pointing at the prototype. It's a bomb. Gasps rippled through the room as security swarmed the stage. The presenter stepped back, alarmed, as Liam reached the prototype. He spotted the hidden device, a small, blinking module attached to the underside. His hands shook as he pointed it out to the guards. It's here. We have to disable it. One of the guards radioed for the bomb squad, but Liam knew they wouldn't have enough time. The blinking light was speeding up. He turned to the head of security. Do you have wire cutters? The man hesitated before handing them over. Liam knelt beside the device, his heart pounding in his ears. He remembered something he'd read years ago about basic bomb setups. He examined the wires red, blue, and black and tried to steady his trembling hands. Red usually means active, he muttered to himself. Blue for power. Liam. Edward's voice cut through the crowd as he pushed his way to the stage. Don't do it! Wait for the bomb squad! There's no time, Liam shouted back, his focus locked on the wires. With a deep breath, he cut the blue wire. The blinking stopped. The room was silent for a moment, and then a collective gasp of relief swept through the crowd. Edward reached Liam, pulling him into a tight embrace. You did it, kid. Liam exhaled shakily, his body trembling with adrenaline. Did we stop him? Thomas approached, his expression grim. We stopped this, but Hale's still out there. And he knows we're on to him. Edward straightened, his resolve hardening. Then we finish this. Hale's games end here. As the summit slowly returned to order, Liam realized he had become more than just a bystander in Edward's war. He was part of it now, and he wasn't backing down. The fight against Hale may not be over, but one thing is clear: courage, loyalty, and quick thinking can turn even the darkest moments into a chance for redemption. Liam's bravery and Edward's determination remind us that standing up for what's right can change the course of any battle. If you enjoyed this gripping tale of resilience and action, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling stories of courage, intrigue, and unexpected heroes. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that even the smallest actions can make a big difference.